I was inspired to become an activist based on three major influences in my life, and I think for all African Americans, and that was the period of enslavement. My great grandmother was enslaved, and she lived for a very long time. So, as an infant, I sort of remember her a little bit. Uh, that was one period, and then my paternal grandmother was a sharecropper, born during the Reconstruction era. And that was important to me as well, because I learned from her about poverty. The third influence were, of course, my parents, who lived in the South through Jim Crow segregation. So I learned a lot about those three oppressive forces on African Americans at a very young age. So my mother wanted me to get as much education as possible so that I could work and help people to deal with those forces that were always mentioned in my life. So I did do what she wanted me to do and became a teacher, and then found out with working with my students, not only in the classroom, but in the communities in which they lived, which were poor communities, that there needed someone to be actively involved in dealing with these forces. So those were the influences. After completing a degree at the University at Albany, I was fortunate enough to get a job working in Albany's South End at Trinity Institution as a group worker. And then along comes the Great Society program, the War on Poverty, under the Johnson administration, which I think was the key here, because the institution was guided by a number of activists who wanted to carry out that Great Society program. So they were able to get a grant, a federal grant to do that, which is interesting because Albany was always controlled by the Democratic machine. Rastus Corning was the mayor, and I noticed that all the people in the Black community seemed to be under some kind of great control. They were fearful of becoming actively involved in any political issues, because the message that they got from not only the mayor's office, but the police department, was that you don't rock the boat. And if you do, you might lose your employment or not get any employment. Your housing might be affected, because many of the people had moved into this very place here, the Albany Public Housing, and people were really afraid. And so that bothered me a lot. The message was, as long as you stay in your place, that you don't venture out of the South End, that things will be fine. And in 1968, James Q. Wilson wrote a book called Varieties of Police Behavior. He also had done a study of that included the approaches to policing by a number of cities in the United States. And Albany was one of them. And he confirmed that. He said that Albany was a very controlled city, and that African Americans were expected to stay in their place. So with this new involvement by the Trinity Institution and these two new social workers who were interested in doing community organizing, they had been trained in the philosophy of a great activist, Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky, told us that you really had to organize the community if you really wanted to change anything. So I got into that. I also realized very early that in order to get people to be organized, they had to have information. They had to organize um, and feel comfortable that they could do it without being, um, you know, put in a situation where they lose. It also included voting as well. Just as that was another influence. People were paid $5 to vote. So we put all this together and decided that we were going to go for the community organizing. So we had to identify people in the community who were upset about the conditions in which they were living, and had to convince them that it was okay that we were going to be trying this new approach. And that was amazing because when I went out looking for people, I came across this woman, and this is probably one of the nicest things that, that I remember about that period of the 60s, was a woman called Olivia Rory. She was a heavy-set black woman who sat on her porch and talked about the problems that she had to deal with. She had 9 children. She was living in poverty. She was upset about policing. The city was not picking up garbage in the South End, so you had to do what you could to dispose of your garbage. So she was a great influence because she helped us with organizing the community. She was a part of the community. She had a very loud voice. She was unafraid. She said, "I don't have anything else to lose." And so we started organizing different neighborhoods to deal with a lot of different problems, which included welfare rights. Opportunity Incorporated, I guess it was called Opportunity Incorporated, was another force in the community that worked with people and tried to get them to become involved. So the most exciting thing about the 60s starting out was that we had to convince people in the community that they could change things. And of course, you have the civil rights movement that had, I think, helped free people in terms of their minds, that maybe they could make some changes. So the civil rights movement, the Great Society program, the War on Poverty, and the influence of community organizers such as Saul Alinsky, I think, set the stage for activity in the South End and all of Albany in the 60s. So the first thing I did was start a newspaper. It was called Voice of the South End. And it started out as a document at Trinity Institution that was used to inform people of activities that were going on. And it caught on quite well. I had to do all of the work pretty much, and it was a mimeograph document, but I distributed at every, for instance, in the Albany Public Housing, which had 4 buildings on Green Street and Rensselaer Street. I think there are about 100 apartments in each building. So you had to go and, deliver this to every one of those apartments, which started it off. People started reading it. And we later changed it to the South End Scene. It was a little bit more professional looking and had somebody else print it. But it became a real force in the community. We moved from presenting information about programming to talking about political issues. And voting was one of them. People started understanding what you give up when you accept money for your vote. And they started talking about it. And I think the brothers also helped in this particular aspect. People started becoming poll watchers. And I remember being a poll watcher in somewhere in the South End, I forget which street it was, but and the police were used to being involved with the whole voting process. So this police officer was at the polling place, and he was leaning on the machine. And we had been trained that, in terms of the voting rights law and what was allowed and not allowed. So I looked at him, and I went up to him and I said, "You can't do that." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You have to be a certain distance from the voting machine." He was angry with me, but he realized that I was right, and he moved. That, was, I think it was an important thing, because it sent the message that we weren't going to allow business as usual. And the community got behind this and started, figuring out if they were at the polling places, if they could go out and talk to people about voting and not accepting the money, that eventually that practice would fall. And it did, eventually. The other thing is that the mayor still had a great deal of influence in the community. And one of the problems with some of the community organizations that had grown up was that they had to do something about garbage, because other communities could afford to have their garbage taken away. The South End could not. And so we decided to organize this campaign of leaving the garbage there. And you know what a mess that could be after a while. The city finally got the message. I mean, it was attracting rats and all kinds of things, and it was a health hazard. And that finally sent the message to City Hall that they had to incorporate garbage collection in the business of running the city. So those were they were very important, because it gave the community a victory. They said, hey, if we could do that, we might be able to do a lot more for our community. So that was, for me, a major victory. And it also attracted people from other parts of the city. All of a sudden, we see people coming from uptown, some of the white churches, and they were forming, this group called, I think, Interfaith Partnership. I think that's the correct name of it, and decided to work on other issues like housing. And one of the biggest things and the most effective things that happened was during this period, you have Bill Kennedy involved as well. And we were working on housing issues. And Bill Kennedy did a story about a landlord on Myrtle Avenue who did not take care of his apartments, and people were living in total squalor. And so he decided to do stories on this problem of absentee landlords. And he wrote a series of stories with great photos and graphics about the situation. And that had perhaps the most important influence in terms of changing the city. The mayor's office had to pay attention. You have all these people refusing to pay their rent. The conditions were horrible. And other people in the community started reading these stories and looking at these pictures of roaches and, on stoves and all kinds of horrible things that were going on. And that pulled even more people into the battle to change the city. And so those are some of the things that I remember being extremely important and influential in changing the community, and certainly changing the South End. I'm a little rusty on the correct names of things, but it was an interfaith partnership. It included like Hubbard. At that time, it was Reverend Hubbard. Father Hubbard, and First Presbyterian Church, and some others, and it brought. It was an integrated group, before everything is sort of segregated. And I think the other thing that's important to mention is and this was in the latter part of the '60s, was Governor Rockefeller, who decided that he had to change the look of Albany. I guess the story goes that he was touring the city with Queen Beatrice from the Netherlands, and he was embarrassed by the way the city looked. And so he decided to do something about it. And his idea was to remove all these people from Hudson Avenue, where he relocated people from that area. And of course, now you know what it is. I mean, it's Empire State Plaza, but that's where people lived. And it made a big difference in the community, because people were moved. There was no plan about what to do with them. And some were moved to the public housing. I keep coming back to the public housing because it had played a major role in the city during the '60s. But the other problem was that the public housing was also segregated, by the way. And we could see that very clearly, that one of these buildings had nothing but whites in them. No one knew what happened to all the other people. And because there was no plan, there was no support or help for relocating people from these neighborhoods. So it certainly changed the character of the community, and particularly the South End. When the '60s started, I don't think the Albany community was that much involved in the whole civil rights movement, because it's still that control factor was there. There was more movement at the State University of New York campus. Some of the students were fairly progressive, and there were some progressive adults who were able to talk to students and get them sort of organized. I remember being a part of one of those groups when this family was considered very progressive, had connections with people at the university who were also progressive, and so they were able to pull students in and got a real education from those people who had been involved actively in civil rights before the civil rights movement. And then some of the students at the university, and there were not very many students of color, by the way, but they were influenced by this small group of progressive people to be involved, like with the sit-ins and lunch counter kinds of things. They did some protests, during that particular period. So it wasn't until after, as I said, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of '65 that Albany started waking up in terms of particularly the African American community, deciding that they had to be involved in change. And so the other influence was the University at Albany in terms of establishing a Black Africana Studies. It wasn't called Africana Studies at that time, but anyways, they were able to pull in some activist kinds of people when they started the Black Studies program. I think it was called the Black Studies program. And they provided some leadership in the community. They would come down to the South End Um, they would have students here who were involved in helping with tutoring kids and that kind of stuff. It also was a time when the Brothers came into existence. And it was really interesting because, again, a lot of the activism centered at Trinity Institution, because they had the money for the Great Society program. And so, there were a number of people who decided that they wanted to have a piece of the pie in terms of employment, and you've certainly heard about the Brothers. So, but they were important in another way, in that they served as a model for other people to become more active. The NAACP also, they had been a force in the city of Albany for a long time, but other than dealing with some of the issues around policing, I know they had a couple of policing cases. Peter Pryor was involved in that. He was a local attorney, and he helped deal with some of the police shootings and things that took place. So that was important. And then it also gave rise to more action on the part of community neighborhood associations. There were neighborhood associations. And so when some issue arose, like the garbage issue, they were able to organize their people on their blocks. And there are pictures of all of us going up to City Hall with our signs and, protesting that issue as well as others. The Erastus Corning was still mayor, obviously, and he, again, was still trying to control things. He didn't want money. He did not want money coming into the city of Albany from the federal government, which meant that he would lose control. But people realized that. And when Trinity Institution, as I said, which was a force, took some action on a lot of these issues, provided leadership. And one case I remember, the city decided to pull their funding. They were getting some funding through the city youth program, and they took their funds away. And so there was a lot of activity on the part of people in the community and to protest that action by the mayor. So you see a lot of demonstrations going on at City Hall as a result of that. But some of the important things that happened after, actually in the latter part of the 60s, because it was drawing in other people, like we mentioned about Father Hubbard. There was also a very activist person at Siena. His name was Bonaventure O'Brien. All these people start coming into the community and being supportive of the civil rights actions that we were taking. I became part of the NAACP Legal Redress Committee. I chaired that committee for a while and took on a number of civil rights kinds of issues. A lot of them dealt with policing. Policing was the major controlling force, and there was a lot of brutality. We started doing lawsuits after a while, which was helpful, but a lot of the focus was on policing, which I think is where it had to be. During the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't as bad because there weren't as many people of color in Albany. They were segregated and controlled pretty much, and as James Q. Wilson said, Albany was one of the cities that definitely used control as a way of dealing with people. So as long as, there were fewer arrests, because, they looked the other way. The police looked the other way when there were things like either alcoholism or, public nuisance kinds of things. As long as it was in a designated area, they didn't bother anybody. But one of the things, of course, was after a while when people started looking for housing in different places, you have a civil rights act that's, so that you can, you should be able to live where you want to and be able to vote. Then things sort of changed. I mean, the police found that they were trying to maintain the control, but it was getting more difficult because there was some movement. There was the impact and influence of the neighborhood groups, groups like the NAACP, and when there was an abuse, people were, felt that they had to say something at that point. So these people who had been organized for one purpose found that they were no longer afraid to complain about the police. So when there was an abuse issue, and certainly NAACP took on a lot of those cases, we started working with other people in the community and lawyers to file lawsuits against the Albany Police, the city actually, for the behavior of the police officers. So you see, probably during the latter part of the 60s into the 70s, you see a lot of lawsuits being filed. You see a lot of more protests against police actions. And then at the end of the 70s, we get into the 80s, and by that time, the community is really very sensitive to police abuse. And so by 1984, when the police shot and killed Jesse Davis, things really changed because the community was absolutely outraged by what had happened because the police murdered Jesse Davis and they got away with it. And that's when the center came into being to become a force, civil rights organization that would deal with issues around policing and criminal justice. So police abuse was very high at one point, and then depending upon what was happening in certain areas in terms of organizing and protesting, it went down. And so it's gone down and up. And then when lawsuits were being filed, of course, that had an influence. It's hard to say in terms of numbers, but there have still been cases that have been ones that the community sort of got behind and tried to stop it. There have been some, cases that were prominent cases that came before the community, and the center has helped do that because the center has become an organization that people will come to when they are abused. So we're able to focus on that abuse and to try to deal with it. The community still complains now that on the street level, they're still not treated equally and fairly on the street, especially with young people, because there have been, for instance, sweeps, drug sweeps that pull a lot of kids in. We did a report on that issue that not only the city, but the state and the feds have organized to do drug sweeps and to use federal legislation to allow that to happen, the RICO legislation in particular. And so it's been, in terms of shootings and killings, I mean, they do happen occasionally, but our young people tell us the problem is still on the street in terms of how they're approached, and because the other influence I didn't mention was the Rockefeller drug laws, which gave police license to do more stopping of people and arresting them and incarcerating them. So those numbers have gone steadily up. But now, I mean, and we define it as colorblind, but it's not really. The impact is on people of color. And so, we're still dealing with the issue of police misconduct. There's a lot of distrust of police currently because of those cases and the treatment on the street. So I think that's a big problem right now that we're trying to deal with, is how do you get the community to trust the police, which I think it's an important issue, because if we really care about public safety, you've got to have the community involved and willing to cooperate with the police to keep the whole community safe. And so that's why we're trying to get others in the community to deal with that issue of trust. And so when an individual case comes up, if somebody gets shot like Elazar Williams was, that made us take 2 steps back. And also there was an incident on First Street recently of police abuse. And so the communities, they're not willing to sit back the way they did, in maybe the 40s and 50s, and just let things happen. So everybody's pretty aware of what's going on and trying to deal with it. Well, social media has had a major impact on how we protest and organize. When I think back what we had to do to organize a demonstration, it meant making flyers on a mimeograph machine. It meant going door to door, knocking on people's doors to get them to understand what was going on and why it was important for them to be involved. And it took a lot of time and energy to get people together. And then social media comes along, and you can put something out there and you inform the community right away. Now, it isn't always that positive, however. We did a session on intergenerational issues around organizing last year with some young people involved. We still find that one of the best ways of dealing with organizing and getting people involved and at a really strong level is to talk to them as individuals. And we don't do that very well anymore. Because, for instance, people have all kinds of reasons why they might not show up at some kind of event. And but you don't know that necessarily from social media. So the quality is different, but you can get people, and which is good, because I strongly believe that in people power, that if you can get people out there protesting or demonstrating, and that can really be helpful to bring about the change that you're looking for. But I also worry that you give up something too in terms of understanding those people who are out there protesting with you because you don't know them. And the way we used to do it, I think the quality was important, to have people really understand and stay involved. So I don't know, I mean, that's for somebody else to look at, whether people who you might get to join in on any kind of demonstration, what's the longevity of their staying involved in particular things, to see it towards the end. One of the things that happened in the late 60s, of course, was the Kerner Commission report. because everyone was concerned about all of the uh, uprisings that had taken place throughout the country during the 60s. Um, there wasn't really that much happening in Albany in terms of that kind of activity, um, but what the Kerner Commission report did say that we are moving um, towards two societies, one black and one white, and talked about racism and its impact on policing and the criminal justice system. And I think we've sort of ignored that because we have not we've never really thought about what racism looks like. And I'm talking about structural, systemic racism, not talking about individual acts of racism, because that's another issue for me. But to understand the impact that it has on our community and how it is interwoven into all of our institutions and how it affects us all. And so we've been dealing with some issues that, you can probably make some changes in terms of how people handle certain situations. But if you don't understand structurally how our institutions include racism and promote inequity in our society, and that's through policing, and I'm dealing with that right now with policing, trying to get them to understand that they, how it plays out, use of stereotypes, for instance, in policing. The Rockefeller drug laws was the perfect example. It created mass incarceration, and people are still thinking about this as individual failures, that crime and criminal behavior is really strictly due to the individual. Pataki, when he was governor, said that. But what we're now trying to get people to understand is that we've gone through this period of the 60s, we've got a Civil Rights Act, but you have to understand that our society found other ways to discriminate. And until we understand that, we're not going to make great movement and great changes. And so our work today is to understand structural racism, what it looks like, and how do you address it. And to me, that's the big civil rights issue today. And we've always tried to find and identify certain ways of dealing with criminal behavior as being a civil rights issue. For instance, death penalty, we define that as a civil rights issue. We define policing and police violence as civil rights issues, and a lot of these are health issues as well. So we're trying to change, to some extent, the definition of civil rights. It's not just law, it's how it's used and how it is part of, how racism is a part of everything that we do. And if we're ever going to be a society that treats people as equals, we've got to understand that. So for me, the civil rights movement thing has changed considerably, and our job now is try to get people to understand what that change looks like.